I'm the author of Modern Data Analytics in Excel. I see a lot of familiar names in the attendance room here. If you're not familiar, I'm a Microsoft Excel MVP. It just means that I've been given that designation for exceptional community service and advocacy for doing things like this. I'm also the author, again, as Modern Data Analytics in Excel, which is what we're going to talk about today. We're going to focus on chapters 5 and 6. The goal of this is that you don't need to have read the book. If you did, that's great. If you want to, that's later. I know the holidays are coming up, so maybe this is a gift idea for you. We will dive right into that content right now, and I will share the link to the downloads shortly here. Apologies for those who tried to tune in last week. I was out sick. You might still hear a little bit of that. I always send out an email ahead of time, or I try to, so that would be the best way to know if I've canceled them. You'll also see on Eventbrite that there'll be a big canceled line up in the event. So just for future, because I saw people like tuning in, sending me messages, stuff like that. Let me put this in the chat. All right, downloads. There we go. All right, downloads are there. So, people are probably going to come in late. If that's the case, feel free to share that. That link stays up. This is just the link to all the downloads from my book. Okay, so what we're going to do is just click that link. Okay, let that download, decompress it. Assuming everybody's on a PC, I probably can't help you if you're not. Don't know very much about Macs. All right, so let that thing download. Give it a decompress here. All right. And then you'll have the resources. Give everybody a second to do that. Let me put the link again in the chat because people are still coming in. Just give me a thumbs up if you can. If you have those downloaded, you can just use the reaction button there in Teams. All right, so I see one thumbs up. I'll wait for a couple more. All right. Okay, cool. All right. Okay, so I'm gonna assume that, okay, I see more than one thumbs up, so that's good. All right, so let's head into chapter 6. Okay, so what we're gonna do today is just a brief overview of Power Pivot. I'm gonna open that file up here. All right. So, okay, there we go. All right. Now there are a lot of ways. Let me open up my notes here. All right. So there are a lot of ways to connect data in Excel. And some of them that we talk about in the book are Power Query. Now, I've done some sessions on Power Query. I was going to do one on last week on actually merging and appending in Power Query, but I was sick, so sorry about that. I'll reschedule it. Okay, so you could do relational merges, right? So your left outer joined, your inner joined, and so forth. Okay, you could also do lookup functions. All right, so that would be XLOOKUP, VLOOKUP, and we're not going to get into the tribal fights over XLOOKUP versus VLOOKUP and stuff like that. As long as you understand the goal is, you have data in one table, for example, like here, we have a branch ID, right? We want to look up this branch ID, so we have data in 3 different tables over here. Okay, so product ID, we want to probably get the corresponding names. We probably want to get the corresponding branches over there. So one way, again, you could do that is with a join in Power Query. And I'll do that at some point. That's one of the previous chapters of the book. You could also do XLOOKUP, VLOOKUP, which we talk about in the chapter on dynamic arrays. And I have a section on dynamic arrays coming up as well. The other option that you can do, and maybe the most top heavy of them all, is actually to create a relational join here. I'm sorry, to create a data model in Power Pivot. And that's what we're going to do today. So let me share this little like pro and con list here just to explain what we're up against. And then again, we're going to focus on Power Pivot here. I will put put this link in the chat here. So probably the most familiar one, when you have this situation where you have multiple tables that you want to connect to, is to write an XLOOKUP or a VLOOKUP or an index match or whatever. It's easy to understand. People get it. People understand it. The biggest single reason to not do this is to avoid the Franken table. Okay, so this is what I like to call these tables in Excel, where you have multiple tables looked up into one source. It really bulks up your workbook. If you think about it, you're duplicating all that information, because what we're having to do, if I go back here, is we have branch name here. I'm going to reproduce this branch name a whole bunch of unnecessary times over here. That's going to really bog down our workbook, and those formulas are often very expensive computationally speaking. Lookup functions just really bog down your workbook. So that's the single biggest reason to avoid the Franken table. That's really what we're going to try to get away from. VLOOKUPs are great. They have their place for ad hoc analyses. There are all sorts of reasons. If there wasn't a reason to use it, it wouldn't be there. However, if you are getting to the point where your workups are getting bigger and bigger to open, you're trying to report data across multiple sources, and things are crashing and that sort of thing, you want to try to think about Power Pivot. Okay, there's also Power Query. And again, there are some benefits to Power Query over XLOOKUP. Again, there's a little bit more overhead, but you have a lot more options. You could do an outer join versus an inner join, and we talk about some of those in the previous chapter of the book. But finally, we're going to look again at Power Pivot. That's our goal for today. We could create a complex data model. We could use built-in calculation functions. So if you've heard of DAX, that's what this would be. If you've ever struggled to do things like compare data year over year or year to date, month to date, things like that, maybe you want to do a little bit more complex of like a cohort analysis or something like that, where you're tracking individual groups over time. Those things can be really difficult to do in Excel, really difficult to do in a pivot table. There's really limited analysis features that any of those tools have. Whereas if we get into Power Pivot, we will have those BI features available to us. But again, the biggest downsides to all of this are it's a little more difficult to set up the data model, and I'm hoping we'll set up a data model together today. There's a more steep learning curve. Okay, if you've heard people talk about DAX, one of the first things that usually comes to mind is how difficult the language is. Okay, and then again, relational modeling is unfamiliar to many Excel users. So depending on your audience, they might not really be familiar with it. Might take a little bit more maintenance on your behalf to get it going. But ultimately, you should be able to build dashboards and reports in Excel that are much more user-friendly than otherwise would be the case with just lookup functions or just Power Query. A lot faster, a lot less clunky. So that's our goal for today. All right, so let's keep going here, and let's go ahead and build our first data model. The first thing we need to do is load in the Power Pivot add-in. So let me make sure everybody has that. I will put a link in the chat. So this is a free tool in Excel. You do need to enable it first, though. So let me find that, get started with Power Pivot. Okay, let me put that in the chat here. All right. For those of you just joining us, we are recording, and it looks like I put a typo in that chat, but that's okay. Okay, you have the downloads there. Get started with Power Pivot. So we're going to walk through this really quickly just so everybody's able to do it together. You should see Power Pivot. Now, I don't even have it right now. Sometimes Excel gets imaginative and bounces it off your Excel. So let's walk through together how to set this thing up. So I'm going to go to File, okay? I'm going to go to Options. All right, so let me actually even put that in the chat. Okay. As for the recording, they're going to be on my YouTube channel. So I will link that out in the email. It will be on my YouTube channel. Let me go to add-ins. Okay, and we're going to go to COM add-ins. Okay. All right. And go. All right. And then Microsoft Power Pivot or Excel. You don't need to load the other ones. There's like Power Map and stuff like that. Just load Power Pivot. Let's click OK. All right, so I gave that link. I'll put that in the chat again. I also have the steps there. Um, while I'm on that topic of recording, some of you have been asking for recordings from like previous sessions. Please look at my YouTube channel. What you see there is what you're going to get. So I've done sessions in the past where sometimes I recorded them, sometimes I didn't. It really just depends. I've tried different iterations, and now my current iteration is to record it, put it on YouTube, and leave it there. So if it's there, that's awesome. These are just free event, activities. This isn't like a binding contract. So if you see a past event, I'll probably do it again. You could ask me to do it again, but if you don't see it, it's probably not there. So I would just, ask for your cooperation with that, so that I'm not getting orders for, past events, which has kind of unfortunately been the case with a few emails in the past. Anyway, I'm going to go ahead and go to Power Pivot. Okay, and this is where we're going to add our data model. Okay, set up our data model, I should say. So you see a few things that are here. We're not going to worry about settings, okay? We're not going to worry about detect relationships because we're going to build this thing on our own, okay? We are not going to worry about add to the data model, so you can almost like forget about this side of it, because what I'm going to encourage you to do, again, we want to think about this as almost like a three-part process, where the first part is going to be load data in via Power Query, do your cleaning, do your transformation, okay, then do your data modeling and analysis, measures, building, and Power Pivot. You could also call that the data model. You could also call that DAX, all similar but not quite the same ideas. And then last but not least, load into Excel. Now, there used to be a thing called Power View, but that's basically been discontinued in favor of Power BI. So Power BI really turned into like the third layer of this system. If you think about, these are the steps that an analyst would take to build a dashboard or build a report. This last step isn't really in Excel anymore. You can still use pivot tables and pivot charts and things like that. I suppose you could use Python and Excel now, or whatever charting. There are some other charting tools that you can use. However, this part really got kind of moved in favor of Power BI. So we're on this step of the game right now, which is data modeling, measures building, and Power Pivot. I wouldn't encourage you to skip any of these steps because, again, we all live in the real world. Our data tends to be pretty dirty. So when you see this step right here where it says add to data model, this will actually load your data, assuming it's in a table. Okay, so we are going to be working head on with tables again. Make sure you're familiar with tables, and it will load that directly to the data model. I would encourage you, however, to take that extra step and load it into Power Query. So that's what we're going to do right now. We're going to load our data from our Excel tables into the data model. All right. So first thing we're going to do is let's actually let me see if I want to open up the Chapter 7 workbook instead. All right, let's take a look at that. Yeah, let's go ahead and go to Chapter 7. So Chapter 6, we're pretty much done with. That was just kind of a primer understanding what is the difference between Power Query, Power Pivot, and lookup functions. Why would you use each one? How do they interrelate? How do you get this Power Pivot add-on added on? Okay, and if you have any questions, if you need to see anything with that again, please let me know. I think there are some people that just came in again, so let me put that in the chat, the instructions on how to get Power Pivot, and also where to get the downloads for today. So we're going to move to Chapter 7, and that's going to be a somewhat more substantial set of data sets, set of tables. All right, So if you ever used Tableau before, I'll give everybody a second to do that. Just give me a thumbs up when you have chapter 7 open, if you could. All right, so that's the file. It's in the chapter 7 folder. Sorry for that, still a little sick. Okay, cool. All right. So I saw a couple thumbs up. We're in chapter 7. If you've ever worked with Tableau, this might be a familiar data set. This is the Superstore data set that comes shipped with most versions of Tableau here. So what we're going to do is, as we mentioned, we want to get out of the habit of we have all these individual tables, right? So we have managers here, and it looks like there's a region table. So your instinct might be, maybe you do want to be able to slice and dice and create different views for your different managers or something like that. There is a region field here. Okay, so we might have the instinct to just write a lookup, okay, and look those managers in. Do the same thing with returns. Maybe we want to understand how returns are trending over time, so forth. That might be your instinct, and these aren't huge data sets right now, but there is a better way to do that. Again, we want to be as efficient with our data as possible. And what we're doing when we're writing these lookup functions is we're really kind of unnecessarily repeating information, right? Because these rows are already giving us the information that we need here. There's really no need to add it to one big Franken table. And that's what Power Pivot's going to do, really obviate the need for creating those big Franken tables that really bog down. And that tends to be the case where people are complaining about their workbooks being slow. Often it stems from this issue. So I definitely encourage you to get, familiar with the basics of data modeling and Power Pivot before, people start get worried about, well, is X lookup faster than V lookup? And they do these crazy like speed tests and, maybe you do some ifs instead and stuff like that. I mean, that stuff is fun, I guess. I don't really see a lot of value in it. I think stick to the concepts, stick to the fundamentals. And one of those fundamentals is just understanding data modeling and not worrying so much about like eking a couple milliseconds out of one function versus another. That's just my kind of school of thought. So anyway, we're going to do that in Power Pivot now. And again, we're going to do that via Power Query because if there are any steps that need to be taken, maybe we don't want some of these regions, right? Maybe we're not interested in some of the dates or something like that. Maybe we don't need some of these fields. Good idea to get rid of them now because it's just going to keep bulking things down. The more data you add, the more measures you create, right? You're just going to get more and more bulk. It's just harder to use. So we're going to do this via Power Query. So what we're going to do is go to data, all right? And let's do from table slash range. Now, these tables are in our workbook right now. They could be other places. They could be in an ERP system. They could be in a CSV file. They could be in another Excel workbook. It doesn't really matter. Just for the sake of simplicity, we're going to keep them all in one workbook right now. Okay. It's not the most usual setup, but just to get started, let's go to from table slash range. So that was data from table slash range. All right, so we're not really going to do anything here. I've done sessions on Power Query. I think a lot of you have been at those sessions. If you've not, I'm going to schedule some at some point in the future. Not sure the schedule exactly yet, but you'll see that, just getting the taste of this, you'll notice most of these features have to do with data cleaning. So this is our data transformation, data cleaning tool. Now we're going to assume that our data is just fully ready to go. We don't need to clean it in any way. But if we did need to do something even as simple as, maybe I don't want this product-based margin field, for example, you just select any of these fields, it's fine. I'm going to go ahead and just hit delete. You'll see that that's gone. Okay, it's listed under applied steps right here. So I just hit the delete key, just select any field you want if you feel like it, or do something else. But then you'll see everything you do, to paraphrase the police, everything's watching you there under applied steps. So we can just go ahead and undo that delete right there, get our data back. So that's really the gist of Power Query in 60 seconds. Again, you can read the book or you can attend future upcoming sessions to learn more. Okay, but we're going to go ahead and focus on loading this into our data model. So this is the step that is easily overlooked. If you miss it, I'll show you how to get back to it. Okay, click close and load, but don't click the big close and load button. Okay, click the drop down. If you already hit close and load, it's okay. There's always going back. All right, so if you haven't yet, hit close and load two. All right, and this is where we want to change our settings. Now, it says, how do you want to load this data into our workbook? I don't really want to load it. It's really just, this is just an intermediary step, right? We don't really want to see the source data. And again, our whole idea is like, we don't want to duplicate the work in our workbook anymore. So it'd be kind of silly to like put this in a table again, right? So we have the raw data and then we have the cleanup data. We're trying to like build a Power Pivot report out of this. So we don't need to see it again. So only create connection. That's going to kind of keep it hidden in the background. We don't need to see it. It's only going to be available for our data model. And that's again going to be done by doing add this data to the data model. So make sure you check that on. All right. If anybody missed those steps, I'm going to click OK and I'm going to show you how to get back and fix it. All right. So let me click OK. So you're going to see queries and connections is just loaded up for me. All right. That's where you want to go to fix this. So that's going to be under data. You're going to go to data. You're going to go to queries and connections. Make sure that this tab is loaded. Okay. If it's closed, again, you can open it. And then what you're going to do is right click and you're going to load to. All right. So that's just going to bring you back to where you were. Again, make sure only create a connection. We don't need to display the data again. That's not how we want to see it. We want to see it in the context of the report. We're going to add this data to the data model. So let's click OK. All right. So that's the first one. So what I'm going to have everybody do now is add the next two returns and orders into the data model. Now, for those automation fiends out there, yes, there is a way to do this automatically, but we need that muscle memory right now. We're going to keep it simple. So just go ahead, take the extra 30 seconds and do it manually. And if you want to find out how to do it later, automatically, you could do that. All right, so I'm going to go ahead and do this with you. Again, let's do returns. We want to add that to our data model as well. Let's go ahead and from table/range. Okay, that looks fine to me. Close and load two. Okay, so you'll see that my settings are a little different. I'll show you how to fix that in a second too. If you want to set this up, if you feel like you want to use the data model more, there is a way to change it. By default, Excel will load the data to a table and it will not load it to the data model. But I set mine differently so that it only creates a connection and it does add it to the data model. So once everybody has set up your data model tables, you've added your three data tables to the data model, we'll walk through how to change those settings if you're so inclined. So let's go ahead and do that. And then I'm going to go ahead and do this one more time. Close and load two. And add that data. Okay. I have loaded my three tables, the data model. Okay. If you've done this, just give me a little thumbs up. Like you can actually leave it right under the chat where it says I have loaded my three tables to the data model. Just let me know when you finish and we'll move on. Okay. I see a few people have done that. Awesome. All right. So if anybody needs more time, let me know. Let me show you the thing I'm talking about. So if you go to get data, I'm gonna go to get data, actually under data, get data, and then query options. Okay. Let's go to Power Query Editor. Actually, no, data load. Wait, no, hold on. There we go. Data load. So what this is going to do right here, where it says default query load settings, it says specify custom default load settings. So you could turn it off where it says load to worksheet, you would turn that off and you could turn on load to data model. And that should set it up. So rather than loading to a table each time and not loading to the data model, it will do the opposite. So perhaps of interest there as you start using Power Pivot a little bit more frequently. All right. Okay, so everybody's done that. Awesome. All right. So let's go into Power Pivot and create these relationships. If you ever used Access before, this is going to feel very familiar because the whole idea, again, is we want to establish relationships amongst these tables. Okay, so you want to think about if you were to write a VLOOKUP, how would you do it to connect these tables? And that's often a good starter point to getting more mature about how to model your data. So let's go ahead and go to manage. Again, we don't want to add directly to the data model because we want that option to load via Power Query if we wish. Also, that's only going to let us load in data that's already in our workbook as a table. Might not be the case. We might be loading it from all sorts of different places. So let's go ahead and go to manage here. All right, so you're going to see some things here. This is the Power Pivot add-in. I will warn you, it's a little bit dated. It's a little bit laggy. It's not as nice as Power BI. A lot of the underlying tools that we're using, you could go to Power BI right now and use these same ideas and these same tools. However, the implementation in Excel is just a little laggy, so that just is what it is. Maybe they'll fix it one day. But you'll notice here we do have our 3 worksheets, okay? And this is a similar situation to Power Query where, if I try to just key over these cells, it's not going to let me. Everything's locked down, right? We're really working with a copy of the data. Um, and this has not been added into our workbook yet, right? We're just seeing this in the add-in, kind of in the background. So this is really our staging environment. All right, I'm going to go over to diagram view. And this is where we're going to see what you may hear referred to as like your schema or your data model visualized. Okay, so we've got here 3 tables. Now, again, your data model could have dozens. Okay, we're intentionally working with a pretty basic one. Our goal is to connect these tables together again so that we can report on all of them at once and then negate the need to write that Franken table. So what we're going to do is try to find those corresponding columns. These are pretty easy. So it says order ID. What I'm going to do is take order ID and just drag and drop that. You're going to see that straight line connect to order ID. Once you connect to order ID, just go ahead and drop it. All right, and you'll see a line that gets connected from order ID. And even if I hover over the line, you'll kind of see which fields are connecting together. So this is kind of similar to like a join in Power Query. Similar idea. We're trying to create relationship amongst our tables. All right. I'm going to go ahead and do the same thing with region. Same idea. Come up here to region, just drag and drop that. All right. And that should be ready to go. Okay, so this is looking pretty good. A couple things to keep in mind here. I'm going to go up to advanced. Actually, let's go to design. So if you go over to design, there is a manage relationships table right here. This will list out all of the relationships in this data model. Now, we're not going to get into some of what these things mean, like cardinality and filter direction. These are really important ideas. As you get into data modeling, you should be aware of what they are. But first, we'll look at where to find them, and you can find them under manage relationships. When in doubt, if you're having a problem, once it comes time to actually load this thing into Excel and build your reports, if you're having problems, if things aren't totaling right, or if you're clicking on a field and it's not getting added for some reason, the majority of the time, the reason is going to be because this isn't set up right. Okay. So we're just going to assume that Power Pivot did its thing correctly for now and move on. But again, that is under relationships, manage relationships. And if you needed to edit these, you could do so up here. although I find it a little bit easier. So this looks a little bit more like Power Query, right? Where we would actually click on the columns that we want to merge by, or we want to create a relationship by. It's really a different concept that we're doing here. Order ID, click OK. That's fine. All right. Or you could always just, delete this and do it over. You could right click, you could edit the relationship. So a lot of different ways to create those relationships there. So this is a pretty simple data model. We're going to look at one more thing here about um, how to really set this thing up well in Power Pivot, and then we'll load it into Excel. Any questions so far? All right. So one thing you're going to notice here is you can drag and drop these tables kind of any which way you want. All right. And there is actually a preferred arrangement for this. And on mine, it looks like Excel already did it. I don't know if that's a coincidence or not, but again, going back to your Excel knowledge, you remember VLOOKUPs, you remember lookup tables, okay? Usually you look up, you're looking up data from one table into another, right? So some of these tables have like supplementary information. So for example, let's go back to the data view. So these tables kind of have supplemental information about the orders. They tend to be more qualitative in nature. There aren't as many columns, right? Whereas over here, this is kind of the main source of the facts, as it were, right? How many orders were made, right? What was the quantity? What were the sales? And so on and so forth. So that's really an important concept to know, because that's one that that it tends to get used when it comes to data models. So we have this idea of our fact tables. So these often are going to say things like, how much, how many, things like that. And then we have our dimension tables, what kind, what category, things like that. So often what you're going to see is this fact table is really the big kahuna of that data model. You've got your dimension tables kind of flanking it. And to really emphasize that relationship, you'll see this so-called star schema, which is basically you have your fact table flanked by dimensions. And that's basically what we have right here. Now, this is a super simple data model, but again, you could think about maybe this is like you have stuff about employee overtime, right? So your fact table is how many hours overtime did they work? You might have another table about who people's managers are. You might have another table, well, what department they're in. So those are all like dimensions giving more context, right, to what the facts are, which is what were the overtime hours. So you'll see this a lot, right? This could have been products. This could be, time off, like we mentioned, wait times, all sorts of different information that this schema would work with. So good to know, right? To arrange it, you'll see this. Sometimes you'll see people kind of put the fact table at the top and the dimensions on bottom, or vice versa. I think it's a generally more accepted practice just to do this star schema. And again, you can just drag and drop these and set that up. So we're doing pretty good right now. We set up our data model. We have established the relationships. We understand some basics about schemas. We know what our fact table is. We know what our dimension table is. So let's go ahead and actually load this into Excel. Uh, we're going to go right here to home. All right. Now, this is similar to Power Query, where if you hit the big button, it'll do one thing. If you hit the drop down, it's got some other options. So you'll see that a lot of these options have to do with building visualizations. They are going to be pivot chart-based visualizations. So if you haven't worked with pivot tables, it's been a while since you've worked with pivot charts, might be a good time to refresh on that. We're not going to do a whole lot with actually building out these reports right now. But you'll see there are some options. Flattened pivot table is just a particular way of arranging the records so that everything's more unnested. You may notice with pivot tables that sometimes it'll try to like overlap categories, region A and then subregion all in one column. If you want more of a unnested, less compact outline, you could use that one. But I'm going to go ahead and just insert a classic pivot table. And again, that's under home. Let's go ahead and click pivot table. Cool. All right, so new worksheet existing. Let's make a new worksheet. All right, so now we have what looks like a regular pivot table. I'm going to right click show field list, make sure I have that. Okay, so you're going to notice a few things here. First one, obviously, there are multiple tables. So that's the biggest difference right away versus a regular, so to speak, pivot table. Now, another thing, and this is just happenstance, because we loaded, I don't know why this is the case, but because we loaded these data sources in from the same workbook, we actually see these double stated in this pivot table field report here. So you see orders returned users and then you see them again. Use the ones with the little orange database icons. Those are the ones that are synced up to the data model. These ones are actually like the raw data tables here. We don't want to use those because again, we haven't established relationships amongst those tables. I don't know why it does that. If we had connected from another data source, like a CSV file or even an outside Excel workbook, we wouldn't be seeing these. So it's a little bit annoying that they're there. You can't hide them, but that's just kind of how it is. So make sure that you use these orange ones. Now you're going to notice that if I hit the drop down, you'll see, right, all of our fields listed here. And we have the ability to mix and match these fields. So for example, maybe I am interested in understanding maybe total sales by manager. Now, manager isn't available in this table, but if I come down here to the users table, there is a manager field. So I'm going to go ahead and click that on. Okay, it'll get added to my Power Pivot pivot table, just like regular. Looks pretty simple. Okay, and now let's go ahead and I'm going to add sales here. Okay, so we have sum of sales by manager, and this part looks the same. I could come over here. It's called sum of sales. If I wanted to make that a currency, I could do that. Okay, awesome. All right, we could maybe even let's go for the trifecta here. And if I put status over here, let's add status to columns. You'll see that now we have return and blank. We could recode that to say not return. I think I could actually type right over this and say not return. Okay, yep, that worked. All right. So what I did where it said blank, I just typed right in the pivot table. So what we're doing here is we're building a report using all three of those tables at the same time. Now, it may not seem like a lot right now because this is a simple table, so a simple data model, but this is saving a lot of computation power. It's going to let us build much more dynamic reports. Maybe we want to trend this, month to date, year over year. We could do all that stuff in a way that would have been very difficult otherwise to have done in regular pivot tables. Okay, so that is our pivot in a nutshell. Um, one thing you're going to notice here when it comes time to understand, actually, let's see here. About 20 minutes to go. Yeah, let's actually move to creating calculated columns. Okay, and then I think we'll do an exercise if you'd like. All right. So one of the fields that are there any questions before I move on, actually? Okay, cool. All right. So one of the fields that is not in here is profit margin. Okay, so I could even search for that. It's not there. So I have sales, I have profit margin. Okay, so I don't know if you ever did this before, but in regular pivot tables, there was an option to create a field in pivot table analyze. So if I come up here, pivot table analyze, calculated field, that option is not there anymore. All right. So we need to think of a different way to calculate profit margin. So let's look at a couple ways to do that. I'm going to show you one way first here, and then that might be a little bit of a cliffhanger for extra sessions. All right, so let's go back to our data model. I'm going to go back to Power Pivot. Let's go to Manage Data Model. So if we want to get back to our data model, we can come back here. Okay, I'm going to go to Data View. All right. Now you'll see that down here, we're going to talk about this probably in future sessions. That Power Pivot did create, this is a measure in Power Pivot. It says sum of sales, it's a sum of order sales. This was created just by virtue of dragging and dropping into our pivot table. Now, there are better ways to do this, and the reason that these are better is for the reason that I'm going to walk through right now. We're going to go over here to orders, okay? And like I mentioned, we want to create a profit margin column. Here, let's call this profit margin. I'm going to go ahead and hit enter. Okay, this is going to take a second. It is a little bit laggier, like we mentioned here in Power Pivot. Just give it a second if you're following along. It's probably even slower on my computer with the screen sharing and everything. All right. So let's go ahead and we're going to take, this is going to look very similar to a table calculations in Excel. I'm going to take orders. Okay. I'm going to take profit. Okay. I'm going to take orders. I think I spelled something wrong there. I did. Orders. And let's, oh, not that. Orders. And let's take sales. All right. I'm going to put this in the chat. All right. Let's go ahead and hit enter. Okay, so this will take a second to build. All right, so we have our profit margins. Fair enough. Now you can format your data over here in Power Pivot. And the nice thing about formatting your data here is that will propagate to any pivot table that you add it to. It's always going to be formatted, for example, as a percentage. So I'm going to go ahead and do that right now. Let's make that a percentage right under here. It's, oops, let me go back to my data model. Manage data model. Hopefully I didn't close out of that too soon. Okay, is profit margin still there? It's still there. Okay, profit, let's make that a percentage. All right, so that is our profit margin. Let's go ahead and add it to a pivot table. Go ahead and just make a new one. Give it a second there. Yeah, that's a little bit laggy. Okay, so when I ever build a new field or a measure or anything like that, I like to cross-check the math myself. So if I put something like segment here, let's do customer segment. I'll add that there. Okay, let's take our sales. Okay, let's take our profit. Okay, let's switch those around and let's take our profit margin. Okay, so it's going to try to sum the profit margin, so that's obviously wrong. Let's go ahead and try to make that an average. Value field settings. Let's make that an average. All right. And that still doesn't look right to me. And again, I'm going to cross-check this here. If I did something like, C4 over D4. So here's the actual profit margin. This doesn't look right. So what is happening here is that if we go back to this data model, okay, it's not letting me back in for some reason. Let's see if I can open it up. Do I have it open elsewhere? I do have it open elsewhere. Okay, so let me get that open. Okay, sorry about that. So what is happening here, and if we could see the data, I think it would be more beneficial, but Excel's not cooperating, is we are not getting a true reaggregation of that data, right? This is just a straight average. Now we know that some sales, right, have more weight than others. Some sales are bigger than others, but that's not being accounted for when we just take a straight average. So you want to think about this as almost like a straight average profit margin, right? Where we are not recalculating. What we really need to do is based on whatever data is in this row of the pivot table, we need to take the sum of profit for that row, right? We need to take the sum of sales for that row, and then we need to take the profit margin. So we need something more dynamic than what just a calculated column in Power Pivot can allow for us. And that is what is going to get us into things like DAX, dynamic, I don't want to say dynamic, I want to say implicit versus explicit measures. We're going to talk about that one later on, but really we need to create a DAX measure, and it does need to be explicit because just dragging and dropping, as you're seeing here, we cannot create, there's no way to come up here into Pivot Table Analyze and create that field from there. We need to go into the DAX editor. We need to create our own explicit measure to do that. Okay, so one last thing here, and then we'll do a little bit of housekeeping and close. This is just a nice little FYI in case you ever need it. For whatever reason in Excel, if you've ever created a pivot table, let's say, for example, I want to get, and I'm going to remove some of this stuff. Let's take this, and I'm going to take order ID. And let's move this into my pivot table. Okay, Excel's going to try to take a sum. We know that's not right. I want to count, right? I want to know how many orders were placed in each category. Now, what this is doing right now, and I know this from various reasons, A, because I know the data, but it's easy enough to just, come back here and say, okay, there are 8,237 rows. And some of these are duplicates, right? So we have orders where there are multiple things filed for each order. Fair enough. Now, Excel doesn't pick that up in just a regular count. We do need a count distinct to do that. And for whatever reason, pivot tables in Excel do not have a count distinct measure. However, Power Pivot does. So if you're ever in a bind here, you need to create a Power Pivot. You need to create a pivot table report, and you need to get count distinct. Just throw the data into Power Pivot, okay? And if you come all the way down here to the bottom, it will say distinct count. So let's go ahead and turn that on, and you'll see the 8,000 turn into about 5,000. So that is how you can easily get a distinct count in a pivot table if you ever need to. A lot more things you can talk about with Power Pivot and DAX and so forth. Hopefully this was a good introduction to the topic. Let me do a couple items of housekeeping and logistics here, and then we will close out here. Hopefully this was a good use of your hour. Quiet audience, that's okay. If you do ever have questions, it makes the session more interesting for me just to know what people are, having trouble with, what they want to know. Again, and we'll talk about that more. These sessions really are just to help me get the message out there, help others promote my business and so forth. So next up, we've got dynamic arrays coming up next week, it looks like. Interactive visualizations, Power Queries. So we do have a 101 on that. We're going to get a little bit further into DAX and KPIs and all sorts of stuff in Power Pivot, then move into things like Python and Excel. If there are topics that you want to see, please let me know. Always looking for new topics. And that brings me to my last item of housekeeping here, which is my event feedback. So you just got an hour, give or take, of like free Excel training. If you go to most webinars, it's not going to be that. They're going to sell you a course. They're going to ask you to get on a mailing list, and they're going to send you emails for like 7 days straight trying to get you to buy something. I don't do stuff like that. I don't have time for it. It's gimmicky. I just want to get the word out there and help people learn Excel. So all I ask in return is if you could fill out this event feedback form. Maybe you have a second or two before you log off here that you could fill this out. Helps me get good data about what people are looking for, what I did well, what I could do differently, give me testimonials that I can use to market my business. So really, really helpful for me if you could do that. And again, that obviates the need for 8 days of emails about last chance, 20% off if you buy now, but wait, there's more. You don't get that stuff when you sign up for these webinars. If you sign up for like any other Excel webinar, I almost guarantee you're going to get that stuff. So, okay, yeah, recordings. I don't know if they're short, Christine. I just post the recordings of these on YouTube. So if you want to go back and look at them, you can do that. It'll all go out in the email. So I will send out that recording. Thank you for the kind words on the book, Baljeet. Yeah, so these recordings go up on my YouTube channel and they'll be there. The downloads will be there as well. I'm going to stop recording and I will send all that stuff out later.